Is meditation important for Buddhists?
Buddhist tradition has refined a number of meditative practices. Two important aspects taught by an ancient Theravada authority named Buddhaghosa, c. 400, are called dwelling in tranquility, shamatha, and insight, vipassana. In order to catch the fish of intuitive knowledge, one has first to get to the calm, clear lake. Attaining a measure of tranquility is a process of disciplined concentration in which the meditator gradually withdraws from sensory input through 19 successive stages of attentiveness and reflection. Insight meditation involves the discipline of observing sensory input with perfect mindfulness in order to arrive at genuine wisdom. Traditional explanations typically recommend shamatha before vipassana, but they go together and the process may actually be circular: tranquility leading to insight leading to deeper tranquility. Buddhaghosa suggests 40 objects for contemplation to eliminate distraction and lead to contemplative states. Each person is characterized by tendencies to one of the three qualities of lust, hatred, and delusion, and must focus on counteracting that major cause of distraction. To transform lust into faith, first meditate on physical impermanence and then on the virtues of the Buddha. Transform hatred into understanding by meditating first on love, compassion, and joy, and proceed to an awareness of mortality and physical dissolution. Turn delusion to deliberation by focusing on breathing as a means to calming. As for the achievement of insight, Buddhaghosa recommends the 7 purities. Here the meditator focuses on the purity of virtue, of mind, of belief, of overcoming doubt, of the knowledge of right and wrong action, of insight into spiritual progress, and of knowledge and insight themselves. Mahayana tradition adapted Buddhaghosa's classical methods to its teaching about the bodhisattva's saving role. Each dedicated seeker progresses spiritually by meditating on the 10 stages of the bodhisattva career. This is the steepest of paths, beginning with the accumulation of merit and knowledge and proceeding through multiple levels of meditative discipline.
Is there a Shinto system of religious law?
Here have been numerous bodies of legislation concerning the structure and administration of the Shinto shrine system, and about governmental controls over the spread of religious organizations in Japan generally. Laws have decreed relationships between imperial rule and religion, and between Shinto and Buddhism, and others have stipulated conditions for religious liberty. But there has never been the kind of comprehensive codification of religious law that one finds in Islam's Sharia, Judaism's rabbinical law, or Roman Catholicism's canon law. Virtually everything related to the regulation of conduct in Shinto tradition has been integrated into an all-encompassing and very demanding, but mostly unwritten, code of ethics. People learn what is expected of them religiously through family and local community tradition.
What signs or symbols distinguish Hindu religious specialists?
Priests in most Hindu temples, whatever the denomination, generally wear a simple body wrap that covers one or both shoulders. Sometimes they will remove the upper wrap altogether. Priests may wear a white thread across the left shoulder, a symbol of initiation into the sacred scriptures. Some priests wear a set of beads, called a mala, or rosary, used to count in the repetition of sacred words or syllables. Around the neck or wrist. Members of various monastic orders often wear a saffron or salmon-colored robe that is the habit or distinctive garb of the organization. Shaivite sadhus sometimes carry the trident, a symbol sacred to Shiva.
What is a creed?
As a general concept, creed refers to the totality of what members of a religious tradition believe. As a technical term, creed means a formal statement that sums up the key points in a belief system. Creedal statements are typically short enough to memorize, but can be long enough to take 2 or 3 minutes to recite. Members of many religious traditions engage in ritual recitation of their creeds as a way of reaffirming their assent to core beliefs. Creedal statements are occasionally direct quotations from a scripture. More often than not, they are a later development, refined by generations of reflection. More elaborate creedal formulas typically evolve only when diversity of views begins to divide a community of faith so that the majority feel a need to define themselves against the unacceptable tenets of an emerging minority. Some religious traditions see no need for creedal formulas.
Have relics ever been important for Christians?
Since very early times, Christians have cultivated a sense of the sanctity of the remains and memorabilia of holy persons. Since Christians believed early on that Jesus had resurrected bodily from his tomb, they began to focus. By around the 3rd or 4th century, on other reminders of Jesus' earthly life. People sought, and sometimes believed they had found, the cross on which Jesus was crucified. The nails that fastened him to it, or the crown of thorns he had worn. According to ancient tradition, St. Helena, mother of the Emperor Constantine, discovered the true cross of Christ. During excavations for her son's new Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The resulting devotional ritual of venerating the sacred relics there may have been among the first of its kind and the beginning of a much expanded practice. During late medieval times, the Holy Shroud, thought to be the winding cloth in which Christ had been buried, became a center of widespread devotion in Europe. A veil, said to be the one with which St. Veronica wiped Jesus' face during his march to Calvary. and to which an image of Jesus' face was transferred, was venerated at St. Peter's in Rome from the 13th century on. Far more numerous, of course, are the relics of martyrs and saints. Some dating back to early Roman persecutions of Christians. Sacred remnants can be anything from entire bodies, skeletal remains, to intact or fragmentary bones and skulls, to items once owned or touched by the holy person. Claims to possession of certain sacred relics have often conflicted. There are several heads of John the Baptist, for example. Famous relics conferred a great deal more than religious prestige on the churches, monasteries, and shrines that owned them, for the more renowned and powerful the relic, the greater the traffic of pilgrims to the holy place. Relics generally have been more significant for Catholic and Orthodox Christians.
What is the Deist Celestial Masters School and why is it important?
Daoism Celestial Masters School, Tianshi Dao, also called Zhenyi, correct one, stands out as the original institutional expression of religious Daoism and one of several early attempts to establish theocratic communities. It was originally known as the 5 Bushels of Rice School. The dues expected of members, the Celestial Masters School. Founded by Zhang Daoling, 34 to 156 CE, in about 142, the sect focused initially on physical, moral, and spiritual healing through ritual confession of faults and exorcism. Regular rituals included recitation from the Dao De Jing and communal meals, with special feasts 3 times annually to acknowledge the 3 celestial bureaucracies overseeing heaven, earth, and water. Over the centuries, the Celestial Masters School has worked to prevent the popularization of religious rituals by attempting to maintain standards in the training of ritual specialists. 2 main divisions, the Southern and Northern schools, developed more or less independently and then merged around the 14th century. After losing ground to various other schools for many centuries, the school has risen to prominence in modern times and now generally dominates the formal practice of Daoism and its rituals. The school is represented officially by the 63rd Master, who lives in exile in Taiwan.
Do Christians have a system of religious law?
For over a millennium, church law grew from the earliest ad hoc responses to particular problems of practice and discipline to an elaborate system called canon law. Early ecumenical councils promulgated their decisions in the form of canons, or laws. Meanwhile, many major decrees from powerful bishops and formal opinions from important theologians added to the increasing body of legislation. Influenced by the codes of civil law of the Emperor Justinian and others, medieval authorities began to systematize the massive and still expanding body of legal tradition. Gratian DC 1179, first began to impose order on the chaos and remained an important authority in Roman Catholicism until his work was thoroughly revised in 1917. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation brought about major changes in the new church bodies. Nearly all of the larger church organizations have developed legal structures of some kind to serve the concerns of what is called church polity, often taking the form of articles, charters or conventions. The legal formulations of the various ecclesiastical bodies typically claim authority only within a particular family of churches. For example, the Southern Baptist, Northern Baptist, and National Baptist conventions have all developed distinctive legislative and procedural frameworks within which to handle matters of policy and discipline.
What was happening in and around Arabia when Islam began?
In pre-Islamic times, the Arabian Peninsula had rarely been at the center of Middle Eastern events. An immense coastline made the land accessible to and from the Red Sea on the west, the Persian Gulf on the east, and the Indian Ocean on the south, but the real estate of that vast, inhospitable ocean of sand held little strategic interest for the regional powers. Local kingdoms had ruled to the north, in Syria, and to the southwest, in the Yemen. Although the Greeks and Romans knew about the place and liked its incense, they never set their sights on the territory. When Muhammad was growing up, an important trade route ran up and down the western coastal region. A highway for exchange from Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and the Yemen to Syria and points north by way of Mecca. To the northwest of the peninsula, the Christian Byzantine Empire ruled. To the northeast, in Persia, the Zoroastrian Sasanian Empire had displaced the Parthians. A client state of Rome, in 226 CE. These two confessional, i.e. religiously connected, empires had been engaged in a protracted tug-of-war over the Fertile Crescent with its enormous river systems. Two Arab tribes in adjacent states did much of their fighting for them, namely the Monophysite Christian Ghassanids for Byzantium and the unchurched Lakhmids for Persia. As it turned out, their ongoing struggle would pave the way for the early expansion of Islam. By the time Muhammad died, Byzantium and Persia had all but spent themselves into bankruptcy and had so worn each other down that neither would mount serious resistance when the Muslim tribes advanced out of Arabia in a conquering mood.
Who is the Virgin Mary?
Mary, the mother of Jesus, occupies a preeminent position in the theology of the traditional Eastern and Western churches. Information about her life is extremely limited, Matthew 1 and 2, Luke 1 and 2. It is clear that Matthew and Luke believed that Mary's conception of Jesus was miraculous, involving no human paternity, and that her son was the Messiah expected by Israel. Mary belonged to the house of David, Luke 1:26, was engaged to man called Joseph. Matthew 1:18, and lived in Nazareth in Lower Galilee, Luke 1:26. The Gospel of Luke relates that an angel of God announced that she, although a virgin, would conceive the Son of the Most High, to be named Jesus, and that he would found a new Davidic kingdom. Luke 1:30-133. Mary consented. When Joseph discovered that Mary was with child, he wished to dissolve the engagement quietly. In a dream, however, God's angel admonished him to marry Mary because the son she would bear was the result of divine intervention, Matthew 1:19-21. The dates of Mary's life can only be surmised. Researchers place the birth of Jesus between 7 and 4 BCE. Granting Mary a minimal age of 16 to 18 years at the time of Jesus' birth. This would place her birth at some time between 20 to 22 BCE. There is no precise information as to her death. At the Council of Ephesus in 431, Mary was proclaimed the Theotokos, God-bearer, or Mother of God. Her position was further defined in the Roman Catholic Church, which in 1854 stated as an article of faith that Mary had been conceived without the original sin that affects all humanity. In 1950, Pius XII declared that at her death Mary's body had not corrupted in the grave but that God had taken both her body and soul into heaven.
What is the purpose of religious rituals?
Religious rituals function primarily to help believers establish relationships of presence, imagination, or memory with the spiritual. There is naturally some overlap among these three goals of ritual. Some rituals affect or mediate a connection between participants and a divine or spiritual presence.
When religion becomes a crime.
The Russian Revolution of 1917 launched a wave of tremendous change in Russia, affecting all aspects and strata of society. When Vladimir Lenin, the principal leader of the revolution, died in 1924, a struggle ensued for control of the party and, by extension, the country. Joseph Stalin emerged as the country's new dictator. By 1929, when longtime rival Leon Trotsky was exiled, Stalin was firmly in power. A ruthless dictator, he quickly set a course of isolationism and nationalism. Policies that would effectively cut the USSR off from much of the rest of Western civilization. Stalin presided over a basic reorientation of Russian culture and society during the 1930s. He instituted severe policies in the realms of art, education, religion, and family life that had a tremendous impact on all Soviet citizens, from the poorest peasant to Moscow's leading intellectuals. This process came to be known as Stalinization. In 1929 laws were passed under which the practice and spread of religion became a crime against the state. Churches were destroyed, priests were stripped of their civil rights, and their children were forced to renounce their fathers or risk death. 3 years later, a program for the total eradication of religion from the Soviet Union was announced. The very notion of God will be expunged as a survival of the Middle Ages and an instrument for holding down the working masses, the official announcement proclaimed. The Communist Party and the Soviet state subsequently established themselves in the place formerly occupied by religion. The study of history, science, the arts, and other subjects also underwent significant change in the 1930s. As the government introduced new conservative standards designed to focus education efforts on increasing worker skills and productivity. Finally, Stalin insisted on a return to traditional family values. Homosexual behavior and abortion were criminalized, divorces were made much more difficult to obtain, and the Marxist-inspired drive for women's emancipation fell into disrepair. To ensure that the masses heeded this new emphasis, it was understood that the state had an obligation to scrutinize all members of Russian society. Thousands were found wanting and were punished severely.
What about devils or demons?
Numerous demons, oni, inhabit the cosmos of popular Shinto belief. But their particular province is the north. They are associated with negative forces generally and bad luck. Rough spirits, Arimitama, are among the larger category of generic spirits or souls. A category of beings called Onryo consists of angry spirits. Other beings called Goryo, or august spirits, are also generally troublesome but deserving of respect for their power. Some of Shinto's most important shrines are known as Goryo shrines. Because the kami dwelling there was once a human being who died under inauspicious circumstances. Another large category of evil spirits is that of Bakemono, a term that refers to several specific groups of beings especially prevalent in folklore.
Do acupuncture and acupressure have any deist connections?
Neither acupuncture nor acupressure is a specifically religious practice. They are associated with healing, but both draw on ancient Chinese principles that have found their way to the center of deist teaching. Illness indicates a lack of qi, the vital force, which courses through the body along an intricate system of meridians. Blockage of vital energy causes an imbalance of yin and yang. Traditional deist-influenced maps of the body associate particular nodes with specific symptoms and internal organs. The whole system is based on a carefully observed network of correspondences. Not only is every part of the human body connected to every other part and to the spirit, but the human microcosm parallels in every detail the macrocosm of the universe. Proper placement of acupuncture needles, or appropriate application of pressure to the malfunctioning energy juncture along any of the meridians seeks to restore the flow and balance, and hence promotes the rise of vital energies that are the essence of health and well-being.
What do the terms diaspora and aliyah mean?
Diaspora is Greek for scattering or dispersion. It refers to the growth of Jewish communities, at first throughout the Middle East, and eventually throughout the Mediterranean and the world at large. Some diaspora communities were the indirect result of the persecution and exile of Jews, not only from the eastern Mediterranean, but from numerous sites throughout the greater Mediterranean basin. In other words, Jews have experienced dispersion after dispersion. Aliyah means going up. In Hebrew, originally associated with travel to Jerusalem, which is a high point in the regional topography. The term came to mean especially the modern-day return of Jews to Israel. It is thus the opposite of diaspora, but much of the impetus for Aliyah continues to come from the very kind of intolerance and persecution that gave rise to many diaspora communities in the first place. In other words, global migration patterns in the history of Judaism have been cyclical.
What does the mysterious learning mean?
Wang Pai, also known as Wang Bai, 226 to 249 CE, and his patron, Ho Yen, are credited with founding the movement known in the West as Neo-Daoism. This name is misleading, however, since the movement grew principally out of Confucianism. It began with studies of the Confucian classic the I Ching, was enthusiastically discussed with reference to the Daoist Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi in the later 3rd century, and in the 4th century merged into Mahayana Buddhism. The movement is probably most accurately known by its Chinese name, Xian Shui, mysterious learning. Wang has been accused of trying to interpret the I Ching in Daoist terms and of praising Confucius as the supreme Daoist because he refrained from saying anything about the ineffable Dao. The truth is that Wang rejected labels such as Confucian and Daoist, and instead strove to unearth the ultimate truths concealed in each. During the waning years of the Han Dynasty, 207 BCE to 220 CE, various thinkers, notably the great Wang Cheng, ca. 27 to 100 CE, had become disillusioned with standard Confucian metaphysics, which had emphasized elaborate systems of correspondences between heaven, earth, and man. Cycles of the so-called 5 elements, and attempts to predict the future based on these. The desire to understand the basic principles of the universe was not lost, nor were the basic ideas entirely rejected, but the simplistic excesses, the teleology, and the easy belief that heaven was regular, purposeful, and concerned with humankind were shaved away. At the same time, the so-called new text versions of the Confucian classics lost their standing and were replaced by versions of the texts purporting to be older. These old texts did not fit neatly into vast cosmological systems and left a cosmological void in Confucian thought. By the end of the Han, the great pattern of the universe had seemingly dissolved into chaos. In the 3rd century, Xian Shui emerged to fill this metaphysical vacuum. Xian Shui is predicated on the belief that the infinite phenomena of this universe are random, transitory, and without any meaningful pattern. Yet they all must, it was reasoned, be generated by one single, eternal verity. That was the original nothingness, Ben Wu, or non-being, Wu, the origin of all being.
Does anything like millennialism have a place in Islamic thinking?
Yes, so long as one understands millennialism broadly rather than as a precise reference to measures of 1,000 years. Numerous hadith, called traditions of discord, talk of various general features that mark a decidedly downward trend in human life. Honesty will be hard to find. Fewer and fewer people will observe the religious law, and violence will rise. According to other ancient traditions, various explicit signs will herald the end of time itself. A resurgence of chaos symbolized by Gog and Magog will mark a radical turn for the worse. The beginning of the final chapter in the unraveling of history. A figure resembling the prophet, called the Mahdi, guided one, will usher in a temporary age of justice. Numerous individuals throughout the history of Islam have sought to gain political power by claiming to be the Mahdi, most recently in 1979. When armed bandits seized control of the sanctuary of the Kaaba in Mecca. A one-eyed Antichrist figure, called the Dajjal, that's Dajjal, will supplant the Mahdi, luring people away through magic masquerading as miracle. Jesus will eventually return to battle the Antichrist, overthrowing that false prophet and paving the way for the day of judgment. Shiite tradition features its own distinctive type of millenarianism. According to the Shiite interpretation of history, Muhammad's spiritual authority was passed along through a series of descendants called imams. In the view of the 12 verse, by far the majority of Shiites. The 12th and last of these imams, also called the Mahdi, went into greater concealment in 940. This hidden Imam did not die but has remained in a mysterious state from which he will return to establish full justice. In the meantime, the Imam hears prayers and intercedes for believers.
What is meant by the term covenant?
Covenant, Berith in Hebrew, describes better than perhaps any other single notion the essential quality of God's relationship to humankind. Discussion of divine initiatives that result in the sealing of a covenantal bond appears early in the Torah and continues through the prophetic books. Covenants were a crucial social cement in many ancient Near Eastern societies, including Israel. Partners in a covenant need not be equal in status and power. Many covenants described between human partners in the Bible are between a lord or ruler and his vassals. A more or less common formula for these lord-vassal relationships evolved. This covenant treaty form typically began with a section in which the lord names himself in relation to the vassal or subject. A brief historical summary recalls all the good things the Lord has provided. That is followed by a list of blessings that will accrue to the subject who is faithful, and the curses that will befall one who is lax or breaks the covenant. Some elements of the treaty form, as well as of the treaty lawsuit the Lord might bring against one who violated the agreement, appear here and there in the Hebrew Bible. Accounts of major covenants between God and his people include those with Noah, Genesis 6 and 9. Marked by the appearance of the rainbow and the cessation of destruction by flood, Abraham, Genesis 15 to 17. Sealed by the sign of circumcision, and Moses at Sinai, Exodus 19 to 24, embodied in the revealed law. At various points in the historical and prophetic books we hear of covenant renewals. A leader, such as Joshua, calls the people to account for their past behavior, and challenges them to reaffirm their allegiance to God, the sovereign. Joshua 24 is a fascinating example of how some elements of the ancient treaty formula apparently survived in the practice of Israel. King David's rule is also marked by a covenant renewal led by the court prophet Nathan, 2 Samuel 7. Prophets, such as Jeremiah, spiritualize the notion of covenant, saying that God wishes to inscribe the special relationship on the tablets of their hearts, Jeremiah 33.
What is a Jewish ghetto?
Some say that the word ghetto comes from the Italian word for foundry and that it came to mean a closed or restricted neighborhood because a Jewish community near a foundry in Venice was declared the only area open to Jews in 1516. The actual practice of restricting Jewish residences to a certain quarter of town is very ancient, even gaining official religious sanction. For example, from the Christian Third Lateran Council in 1179 in Rome. Jews have been forced to live in ghettos in many times and places. Most recently, Adolf Hitler used the practice fairly early in his career as a way of controlling Jewish residents. Nazis in effect turned these ghettos into urban concentration camps. The Yiddish term Shtetl was the common European Jewish term for the local community, but it did not carry the often gruesome connotations now borne by the word ghetto.
Is there a central teaching authority for Muslims?
No single individual or institution has universal authority over the global Islamic community. For Sunni Muslims, the nearest approximation to centralized teaching authorities are religiously affiliated educational institutions in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, venerable and influential for very different reasons. Cairo's Al-Azhar, founded in 972 by the Ismaili, Sevener Shiite, Fatimid dynasty, has worn the mantle of religious prestige and authoritative conservatism since it was converted by Saladin and his dynasty. After 1171, for the task of defending the cause of Sunni Islam. In Saudi Arabia, educational institutions of Mecca and Medina have come to share in Al-Azhar's prestige in modern times. Young men seeking careers in religious studies come from all over the world, looking forward to returning home with credentials from these institutions. Nowadays, a senior jurist somewhere might on very rare occasions issue a legal advisory fatwa, claiming universal force, so that every Muslim ought to abide by it. The Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, delivered an order that Salman Rushdie was liable to the death penalty for blasphemy. And Osama bin Laden has called for a jihad against the United States. But rare claims of that sort do not have the binding authority of a centralized institution like the papacy. In various parts of the world, religious scholars join together for consultative purposes. In the United States, for example, a council of imams holds regular gatherings to discuss practical and pastoral problems that arise in local communities. Elsewhere, muftis in a given region sometimes submit their decisions to the further judgment of a grand mufti, who exercises special jurisdiction in religious matters.
Do Jews call their scriptures the Old Testament?
Old Testament is a term originally used by Christians as a convenient way of characterizing the relationship of the Hebrew Scriptures to the Christian or Greek Testament. Although one might hear the term as a pejorative reference to a revelation once valid but now abrogated and rendered superfluous, some Jews still speak of the Old Testament as a concession to common usage. Christians generally regard the Hebrew Scriptures as integral to their faith tradition but of secondary authority whenever it is necessary to resolve an apparent conflict or contradiction between the testaments. For Jews, Tanakh is the only testament.
What does speaking in tongues involve?
Speaking in tongues or glossolalia, from the Greek glossa and lalia, tongue talking, refers to the phenomenon of excited utterance apparently not identifiable as any known human language. Linguistically, therefore, speaking in tongues amounts to little more than a string of nonsense syllables. However, psycholinguistic research has discovered similarities across cultural and traditional lines, suggesting that trance-like states induced under certain circumstances all over the world may bring About common neurophysiological changes with similar results regardless of religious affiliation. Christian tradition has often regarded the gift of tongues as a spontaneous behavior. But it appears in fact to be learned. Some Christian groups place so much emphasis on the practice that it has become an indicator of full membership. According to Acts of the Apostles 2:4, when Jesus' closest followers were filled with the Holy Spirit, they began to speak in various identifiable languages, so that all the people present from whatever land clearly understood them. In I Corinthians 14:1-40, Paul cautions that the gift of interpreting is as important as speaking in tongues, and that without interpretation, there is a danger that speaking in tongues by itself can be divisive.
What were some of the other regular festivals once associated with CIT?
Many of the religiously significant times acknowledged with rituals in sacred sites affiliated with CIT overlap with popular deist and CCT practices. The literati, who functioned as ritual specialists in service of the imperial house, generally looked down on deist and CCT devotionalism and often made fun of their beliefs. But as servants of the emperor, they could hardly afford to snub the very deities to whom the general populace prayed for success in mundane but important matters such as timely rain and abundant harvest. When the emperor's far-flung political administrators entered into their roles as religious ritualists, they often found themselves crossing an imaginary line from the elite to the everyday life of the locals, celebrating days associated with deities of purely local or regional origin and importance remain the task of deists and practitioners of CCT. But when they paid homage to local or regional deities whom the emperor had elevated to the CIT pantheon, the literati were providing implicit legitimation for popular beliefs and practices. In addition to the birthday of Confucius on the 27th day of the 8th lunar month, CIT also celebrated new and full moon occasions, some of which coincided with feasts like that of Lao Zi, second month, day 15, and the Hungry Ghosts, 7th month, day 15.
What do Christians commemorate on Holy Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday?
The Easter Triduum, 3-day period, begins with the commemoration of the evening on which Jesus gathered his apostles for the Last Supper. Maunde, from the Latin word mandatum, the new commandment of service Jesus gave his disciples then. Or Holy Thursday is marked in several churches by special rituals, some of which include a symbolic washing of the feet of several attendees by the priest or bishop. Good Friday recalls the crucifixion and death of Jesus.
What are some of the main of Confucian and CIT officials or ritual specialists?
Strictly speaking, Confucians have no separate structure of ritual officials. Bureaucrats of the imperial administration were responsible for offerings performed in Confucian memorial halls. The emperor himself was the supreme ritual specialist in the sense that he exercised sole rights to perform certain ceremonies judged essential to the good order of life under heaven. All subordinate, regional, and local ceremonies were delegated to the various ranks of the literati. Today, even in the absence of imperial structures, government officials still play that role. In imperial times, the emperor's administration was divided into 9 departments. Most important in this context was the Imperial Academy, whose chief officer was the Minister of Ceremonies. His function was similar to that of chief priest, since he was responsible for rituals performed in all imperial temples. A common ritual at local imperial altars required that a newly appointed local magistrate stay overnight before his official installation. In the temple of the spirit magistrate, a deity who was the earthly magistrate's celestial model,
Do all Jews belong to the same large group?
Jews have formed a number of important sub-communities throughout their history. Though there are generally fewer formally constituted denominations, sects, or other subgroups in Judaism than in most other major traditions. That is quite remarkable, considering the relatively small global population of Jews and the enormous diversity of cultures in which Jews now live. Major differences among Jewish communities appear most frequently in the relative strictness of ritual observance. Variations in theological views are also noteworthy in some cases, but they are less critical. Strictest in observance are Orthodox Jews, with conservative communities somewhat less strict. Further removed from the nearly all-inclusive adherence to biblical and traditional practices stands Reform Judaism. And most flexible of all, both doctrinally and ritually, are the Reconstructionists.
Do millennialism or messianism have a place in Shinto thinking?
Mainstream Shinto thought has not developed millennialist or messianic themes of any significance. Some recent sectarian movements, however, have centered around such notions. Events surrounding and in the aftermath of World War II, not surprisingly, raised questions of Japan's historical destiny for many Japanese. So-called new religions of Japan, many with roots deep in Shinto tradition, have been fertile soil for messianic expectations. One such organization is Ananikyo, which teaches open relationships with and among the 5 Nai religious traditions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism. Various relatively recent Shinto-related cults and sects have centered around charismatic leaders whose teachings focus on preparation for an apocalyptic end of this world. For much of the 1990s, for example, members of a group called Aum Shinrikyo attempted to implement the doomsday doctrine of their leader, Shoko Asahara, conspiring to plant biological and chemical agents in Tokyo subways. They planned the final act of human history.
What does the rebirth of a non-self mean?
Buddhist tradition has devised various intricate ways of explaining this problem. One widely used image is that of a seal ring. Take a pad of warm wax and press the seal ring into it and you get a very clear impression. One that firms up as the wax cools. You've transferred something without actually leaving anything but an impression. The seal ring is something like what remains when a human being dies, still enslaved to inappropriate craving and desires. It represents the whole complex of psychic energies that make up a human personality. Energies so potent that most people are perfectly convinced of their individuality and separate personhood. In the cycle of death and rebirth, what transfers from one existence across the chasm of death into the wax of a new embodiment is precisely that incredibly powerful ego impulse. As the Buddha saw it, no one can be finally free so long as he or she clings to the notions of I, me, mine.
Who was Matteo Ricci and what was his role in China?
Matteo Ricci, 1552–1610, was an Italian Jesuit missionary who opened China to Roman Catholic evangelization. He was the best-known Jesuit and European in China prior to the 20th century. Born at Macerata in 1552, Ricci went to Rome in 1568 to study law. In 1571 he entered the Society of Jesus. After studying mathematics and geography at a Roman college, he set out for Goa in 1577 and was ordained there in 1580. In 1582 he was dispatched to Macau and started to learn Chinese. In 1601, Ricci made his way to Beijing and received a warm welcome from the emperor. This imperial favor provided Ricci with an opportunity to meet the leading officials and literati in Beijing, some of whom later became Christian converts. Ricci obtained a settlement with an allowance for subsistence in Beijing, after which his reputation among the Chinese increased. Besides the missionary and scientific work, from 1596 on he was also superior of the missions, which in 1605 numbered 17. When he died in 1610, he was granted a burial place in Beijing. Some of the outstanding Chinese literati with whom Ricci had contact later became his converts, including the famous scholar officials Hsu Kuang Chi, Li Chi Tsao, and Yang Tiing Yun. Ricci's writings include about 20 titles, mostly in Chinese. Ranging from religious and scientific works to treatises on friendship and local memory. The most famous of these are the Mappamondo and the True Idea of God.
What kind of calendar do Daoists and practitioners of CCT observe?
Firmly anchored in traditional astrological calculations, the Chinese lunar calendar consists of 12 months of 29 or 30 days, since the time between new moons is about 29.5 days. The lunar year dovetails with the solar with the intercalation of extra months at certain intervals. Reckoning began around 2637 BCE, so that the year 2000 marks the year 4637. Each of the 12 animals of the zodiac is associated with a particular quality or event and gives its name to every 12th year. Beginning with the rat, industry and prosperity, and proceeding in order through ox, spring planting, tiger, valor, hare, longevity, dragon, power and good fortune, snake, cunning, horse, perseverance, sheep. Filial piety, or goat, monkey, health, rooster, protection, dog, fidelity, and pig, home and family. The year 2000 is the year of the dragon, 2001 that of the snake, 2002 that of the horse, and so on. 5 full cycles, each named after one of the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal and water, equals 60 years, an important interval for ritual purposes. Major annual markers are the winter, maximum yin, and summer, maximum yang, solstices and vernal and autumnal equinoxes. During each month, the most important times are the moments of new and full moon. Each month is divided into 10-day periods, 6 of those in turn considered a special time period, and 6 of those in turn equaling a full year. In addition, each year is divided into 24 climatic periods called breaths or nodes, described by such phrases as full of snow or clear and bright. Every year, month, day, and hour is further identified by a combination of 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches, the monthly or zodiacal symbols. Branches and stems are primarily numerical designators, but each also bears important symbolic connotations. If you match one stem with one branch for succeeding years, S1/B1, S2/B2, S1/B11, S2/B12, S3/B1, and so on, you end up back at the beginning after 60 years. The result is an extremely detailed system of pinpointing special times according to a host of definitive characteristics. Each event occurring on Earth has its heavenly parallel. For every conceivable type of human behavior there is an auspicious moment. Thus, the calendar has been not merely a way of keeping track of times for religious observances, but a kind of temporal map for negotiating the cosmos as well.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT celebrate the birthdays of any religious figures?
Deities both great and small are generally thought to have birthdays because the vast majority of them were once human beings. CCT has transformed numerous figures originally deist, Buddhist, and Confucian into more comfortable characters, members of everybody's family, in effect. Other deities remain in their more exalted original deist forms. The following are only a few of the literally hundreds of divine birthday dates. Among the earliest in the year is the Jade Emperor, celebrated on the 9th of the first month. On the third day of the second month, CCT acknowledges Wen Changdijun, the god of literature and learning. Guanyin's birthday occurs on the 19th of the second month. Xiantian Shangdi, the supreme emperor of dark heaven, was born on the 3rd of the third month and is celebrated in some 400 Taiwanese temples. A quasi-deist deity called the Great Emperor who protects life, Bao Sheng Da Di, is celebrated on the 15th of the third month. Ma Ziu, often referred to as the Great Aunt or Grandma, has her celebration on the 23rd of the third month. On the 13th day of month 5 the general become deity Guandi gets his due. An otherwise anonymous city god's day is the 15th of the sixth month. Devotees of CCT observe the birthdays of Cao Jun on the third day of the 8th month, and that of Tu Digong on the 15th. Also on the 3rd of that month deists celebrate the birthday of Si Ming, the director of destiny, known in CCT as the kitchen god or hearth deity.
What is the tree of Jesse?
According to ancient tradition, Jesus was a direct descendant of King David, who was the son of a successful farmer named Jesse. Beginning in the Middle Ages, the tree of Jesse became a very widespread visual symbol displayed especially in the stained glass windows of Europe's great Gothic cathedrals and in illustrated manuscripts of the Bible. Depictions of the tree typically show an aged Jesse sitting or lying down, with a large tree growing from his upper body or from the middle of his back. On the lower branches and trunk are shown the faces of David and Solomon and their royal descendants, along with other important figures in the genealogy of Jesus. An image of Mary holding the child Jesus typically appears at the apex of the tree. The symbolism emphasizes both Jesus' royal legitimacy and Mary's restitution for the evil originally caused by Eve eating from the tree of knowledge.
Who are the Samaritans?
After the northern kingdom's capital, Samaria, was overrun by the Assyrians in 721 BCE. Many of the leading and best educated Jewish citizens were deported. the invaders imported significant numbers of colonists who gradually infiltrated the people of Israel. They came to trace their ancestry to the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, thus identifying themselves as Jewish at least genealogically, and intermarried with Jews. The Samaritans established their own temple on Mt. Gerizim. As a result of a falling out with Nehemiah in the 5th century, the Samaritans split off from Judaism more or less definitively and came to think of themselves as a separate people. Now very few in numbers, the Samaritans still have their own version of the Torah and distinctive codes of religious law. At Passover they still sacrifice a lamb on Mt. Gerizim. Only a small community of Samaritans, well under 1,000, survive. Plagued by health problems as a result of inbreeding. Most Samaritans live around the city of Nablus in the West Bank.
What do Jews believe about God?
God is both utterly transcendent and strikingly accessible, both awe-commanding and irresistible. As the ultimate majestic power, the merest hint of divine nearness brings all creation to its knees. This God is the Holy One of Israel, into whose presence only a fool would enter nonchalantly. Any person of sense knows instinctively that to approach God is to be filled with dread. That's what holy means: forbidden, off limits. Holy other. Dread is not always a bad thing. Here it is clearly an appropriate response. This does not mean that God is cruel or despotic. Although some scriptural accounts might seem to convey that impression. Recall the story of the men assigned to carry the Ark of the Covenant to its new abode. When their ox stumbled, one man lunged for the ark to keep it from slipping from the cart and was instantly struck dead. The point of the story is that God means danger. And when God claims allegiance, there is no room for the tentative. Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son Isaac. Israel's kings and military commanders were ordered to commit total war, sparing nothing, so jealous was God for complete dedication. At the same time, Jewish images of God convey a divine intimacy and immediacy. God creates all things by the unimaginable power of divine speech. Every divine word is immediately embodied in some undeniable event. God walks with Adam in the cool of the evening and delivers through the prophets a message of absolute tenderness. Most of all, the God of the Hebrew Bible is unfailingly devoted to his people. This God acts in all the events of human history.
What is the basic Confucian concept of appropriate moral leadership?
Confucius believed that order was essential for bringing out the best in human beings. He and his disciples rejected the early deist notions that all things work for the best if only people learn the ways of nature and that there is no need for government or military force or oppressive laws. In Confucius' view, government was essential, and that almost always required bureaucratic structures. But he believed the external trappings had to be supported by a foundation of example rather than coercion. No one can bring about the good society by force of will. One can only foster appropriate government by creating an environment of propriety, reciprocity, and good music. Yes, good music. Law, he believed, can erode moral values because people often prefer to act a certain way merely to escape punishment. The example of a great leader is preferable, for it instills a sense of healthy shame that leads people to seek improvement. Confucius was a realist, however, and conceded that law was often a practical necessity. What he wanted for the people most of all was the sense of confidence that can grow when people feel prosperous and educated. A good leader knows how to bring out the best in his people and how to wield authority deftly. But as a concession to the vast differences among human beings, government needs levels of power. Some can lead. Some can support a leader, some can follow but may not understand why they ought to do so. A leader knows how to cultivate conditions conducive to the betterment of society by tapping the roots of human resources rather than waiting until the plant is fully grown and incapable of nurturance.
Are Unitarians Christians? How about Jehovah's Witnesses?
Unitarians, by definition, profess belief in a non-Trinitarian deity, denying the divinity of Jesus. Insistence on the unipersonality of God finds ancient echoes in teachings declared heretical by early church councils. Jesus' role is that of an important prophet, teacher and ethical model, but no more than an especially favored human being. Unitarianism began as an offshoot of radical Reformation groups and in modern times was significantly reinterpreted by American thinkers William Ellery Channing (1780–1842) and transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson (1803–82). Many Unitarians consider themselves part of the larger Christian community, but generally prefer the identity of an open community not defined by assent to a particular body of doctrine. Jehovah's Witnesses was founded in the United States by Charles Taze Russell, 1852–1916. He emphasized messianic expectation based on an Old Testament concept of theocracy. Jehovah's Witnesses publications have generally maintained a consistently critical attitude to mainstream Christian beliefs.
How did Buddhism develop in the Himalayas?
Like Vietnam, the Himalayan kingdoms, Tibet, Sikkim, Nepal, Bhutan, also became part of the northern transmission. But there the various lineages that constitute Vajrayana, Thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism took hold. Tibet was the homeland of this branch of the faith. with its distinctive blend of indigenous shamanism and esoteric interpretations of the Buddha's teaching. Tibetan Buddhists also developed their own extensive scriptural canon. Of all the subdivisions of the monastic Sangha that evolved across Asia, none is more varied and colorful than that of the Vajrayana. From its most famous lineage, the Gelugpa, comes the succession of holy men called Dalai Lamas.